Hello, everybody. A very warm welcome. Thank you so much, Bei der Tagung, for your very inspiring speech. Thank you, Hans. My name is Alex Lewitsky. I'm the director of the Sussex European Institute, where we're engaging with East-West inequalities in Europe and sometimes also North-South inequalities in Europe and also related mobilities. It's a very special pleasure for me to host this panel today for various reasons, because in this room there are various fellow travelers over the years and we're all here together. Firstly, just to put this event together required an eye-watering amount of emails. So it makes me all emotional that we're all here in this room now. Thanks very much to my colleagues, Jure Leko, Yannis Panagiotidis and Hans Christian Petersen. And to Steffen Schaar from the RDS, who bore with us all these emails, and the Antidiskriminierungsstelle des Bundes for allowing us to do this research and to put this event together. We're very privileged to be here with you today. Secondly, I'm very, very honored to be speaking right after Bei der Tagung, because we have, well, shall we say, connected biographies. We've both grown up in a part of Germany, Bavaria, which those of you who know Germany, and she's revealed her age already, so I feel I can say, we've grown up there in the 80s and 90s, unrelated from one another. But, it wasn't the best time to grow up in Bavaria. That was, for those who haven't been here in the 80s and 90s, that was even before we had the ridiculous category of Migrationshintergrund. So, we were Ausländerkinder and positioned in a specific way within these racialized hierarchies that operate within that category. So I think it's probably against some odds that we're both here today, but that wouldn't stop us. So for that reason, I'm very pleased to be here. Another reason why this event makes me quite emotional is because it's for the very first time in the history of Germany that we have an event where we can discuss anti-East European racism in a framework like this, in a building like this, funded by the Federal Anti-Discrimination Agency, with all of you here. We had incredible interest in this event. That was another eye-watering moment. Thank you all so much for coming. It is always challenging to introduce a new topic into the research agenda and the political agenda. It is long overdue to talk about the dark history of the racialization of Europe's East and the way in which it resonates until today. So this is a special moment for me and thank you so much for being here. And finally, I'm extremely pleased to be sharing this panel with some fellow travelers who've been pushing this research topic on the international agenda and in Germany as well. And so what we're trying to do here in this first panel is we want to locate ourselves conceptually. We want to learn from people who've been conceptualizing this specific form of racism in distinctive ways. We sort of rise above the everyday and look at the wider historical trends that have brought us here, and that's, so to speak, a kick-off for our more applied debates that we'll be doing with the rest of the conference. I feel I should apologize that we're switching between languages. We have, perhaps it's not ideal, but the budget didn't quite stretch to a translation. So I apologize that we're switching between German and English, and I really hope, do let us know if problems arise from this, and I'm very happy to apologize to you in person for this. I think without much further ado, I will introduce my panelists here with me today, and we'll have, we're aiming towards 5 to 7 minute inputs, but we do have a little bit of time. So from the moment that we're getting to 10 minutes, I will start nervously jumping up and down. We'll start with Professor Manuela Boatka, who is a professor in sociology and head of the School of the Global Studies program at Freiburg University. She has published widely on decolonial perspectives on global inequalities, Gender and Citizenship in Modernity and Coloniality, and the Geopolitics of Knowledge in the East of Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean. That's what makes her very special to me, that she connects these vast geographical spaces and the various ways in which they have been put in hierarchical relationships to one another, and the histories of extractivism that worked parallel in these contexts. She's connecting those, and so very few people are able to not only speak the languages of all these various places and connect them analytically. So I'm very honored to have you here with us. I should also say, before I... I should also say, in case you haven't read all her books, I'll tell you quickly about the ones she's written. She's the author of multiple monographs, including Global Inequalities Beyond Occidentalism, and more recently, together with Anka Pavulescu, one of the greatest books ever written, Creolizing the Modern, Transylvania Across Empires, which has won very prestigious international awards, deservedly, of course, and has been translated into various languages, including German and Romanian. So without much further ado, I'll hand over to Manuela. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you so very much, Alex, for the very generous and warm introduction. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm very happy to be here to have the opportunity to be on this opening panel for a formal framework of a topic that should be part of the research and the policy agenda for quite some time, but has not been. So the fact that there is now a podium and there is kind of a space, including a head space, thank you, for this is, I think, extremely significant. Now, since we only have 5 to 7 minutes, which I'm going to try to stick to, a title such as Disparaged Europes and European Elsewheres, especially in this font size, is almost threatening. There's no way I can talk about all of this in 5 minutes, but there are actually here in the title 2 concepts that I've worked on: Disparaged Europes on the one hand and European Elsewheres on the other, that speak to the 2 regions that my colleague Alex Levitsky has mentioned that I'm trying to connect. The disparagement of the European East on the one hand, and the active forgetting of Europeans' colonial possessions, not only, but especially in the Caribbean, that are still formal colonies today, but are not allowed to be called that because we have said goodbye to the language of colonialism, but not to the power relations that have structured it. And so European states still claim territories across the world's oceans. And the budget allocated to parts of the European Union as to parts of these territories are connected. And there is competition over the budget and its allocation, only that we only hear about such competitions as being about European Union territories when there is a crisis or when there is a conflict. Other than that, and sometimes we also hear about the European Space Agency located in French Guiana, because that's where some weather satellites are being launched from. But other than that, there's no connection between the European East and Europe's territories in the Caribbean, the Pacific Ocean, the Indian Ocean, and so on. What does this have to do particularly with our discussion here? If we ask the question, and I think it's a brilliant title, the one that we're dealing with here, especially also the subtitle, right? Do we need an Eastern enlargement of the racism debate? And yes, I would totally agree that we do. But the pun, in a way, and I'm sure that's how you intended it, in the question itself, an Eastern enlargement of the racism debate, points to the fact that the first time that the enlargement of the European Union had a geographical direction was when it was about the European East. When Austria became a member of the EU, nobody talked about the European enlargement to the East, although it's in the name. It's Österreich, right? It's Austria. It's like, it's there. But it wasn't to the East. It was an enlargement. There was no enlargement to the South or to the North or to the... It was only an Eastern enlargement when it was about incorporating the disparaged Europe, the one that is not supposed to be discussed as part of Europe unless it is specifically qualified. This is something that historian Maria Todorova has called an unmarked category. We always know that Europe means Germany, it always means France. If we really want to make sure that it also means Poland or Romania, we need to mark it. So Eastern Europe is a way of making sure that we're talking about an other Europe. And discussing this disparagement and this racist ascription of all sorts of, some of those dichotomies have already been discussed or mentioned, civilized, uncivilized, and the productive and lazy, and so on and so forth, that is always relegated to the East, is part of understanding that we have always had for as long as Europe has become a construct of civilizational triumph, more than one Europe. And so if we don't get to theorize much about what disparaged Europe means, because it's always in the title itself, or it's in the term itself, the fact that we should discuss Europes in the plural shows us that we have something that Martinican scholar Edouard Glissant has called the West as not a place, but as a project. The West is not in the West. It's a project, not a place. We can say the same thing about Europe. Europe is not in Europe, but it's both on the continent, in continental Europe, and there are different Europes with degrees of Europeanness ascribed to them on the continent, and there are European elsewheres, such as Europe's overseas territories and outermost regions, that are integral parts of the European Union, and EU officials know that, but they are never discussed as what it means to be European or to Europeanize. I was born in Romania. I came to Germany in the mid-90s. And I had been accustomed to thinking that I was European. And growing up in Bucharest in the last decade of the Ceausescu regime, I did not have to think about whether or not I was white. Although I should have, but anti-Roma racism was not something that was speakable or addressed in a state socialist regime, even less than in others. So coming to Germany, at the time when the idea of an Eastern enlargement started to be discussed, I had to realize that all of a sudden it wasn't so clear that I was European, because I was ascribed, and I had the citizenship of, a nationality that was supposed to be Europeanizing. So I was surprised to realize that my country and several other countries that were part of the Eastern enlargement still had to Europeanize, asking myself, so where were they before if they weren't in Europe? The same kind of discourse was being directed at Turkey, and had been directed at Turkey for a long time, although Turkey's bid to membership of the EU dates back to 1986, with the argument that it's also not geographically in Europe, it's not Christian, so there's several reasons why it shouldn't be part of Europe. If we think of French Guyana and Guadeloupe and Martinique, or Mayotte in the Indian Ocean, they are really not in Europe, so that is not a criterion. This is my very short attempt at connecting the way the disparagement of different Europes and Easternness as a kind of lesser Europeanness is part of this disparagement to the ongoing colonial present of European territories, something that we haven't talked about enough, and that I think deserves a space in our understanding of what it means to be European. And normally, Europeanness reduced to whiteness, reduced to continental Europeanness, reduced to or conflated with Christianity, leaves out most of the diversity that we need and that we have had in Europe. And that is something that we've tried to address in the book that was mentioned, Creolizing the Modern. We need to creolize our understanding of what it means to be European. Europe and Europeanness is not homogeneous, is not racially, ethnically, but also not socially or culturally homogeneous. And this is what makes us richer, not poorer. So this is, I think, the kind of target of some of the discussions that we're going to have in the next 2 days. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manuela, for that inspiring input. So what we'll do is we'll have inputs from all our panelists, and afterwards we turn to a discussion. So it's my great pleasure to now introduce Professor Ivan Kalmar, who is a professor in anthropology at the University of Toronto. And his research has explored how Jews and Muslims have been portrayed in similar ways in the Christian cultural heritage, which I find, so inspiring and so important, because it becomes more and more difficult to think about these racializations in conjunction this day. So, I can only direct you towards Ivan's work on early Orientalism, which shows these shared histories of racialization. More recently, he has studied illiberalism, which he theorizes as response to injustices, inequalities, and insecurities created by neoliberal globalization. And he's published several influential special issues on Islamophobia and illiberalism in the east of Europe. And most recently, his monograph, White But Not Quite, a title that has blessed us all, has flown off the shelves, also obviously received important awards, and has been translated, or is in the process of being translated, in various languages, including Czech and German. And he currently holds a 5-year research grant from the Canadian Research Council, which explores illiberal discourses on the periphery and thinking Southern and Eastern Europe together. I would like to add that I personally have been really inspired by Ivan's work to think about the historical role of Christianity in the making of ideas of race, particularly for me, in the German context, that was quite relevant. But there's also, you should all know, there has been a famous dinner in Covent Garden in 2019, where Ivan encouraged me to think about East-West inequalities through the lens of racialization, that led to a special issue, which we published together last year. Without much further ado, I'd like to hand over the microphone to Ivan.
Thank you very much. I think I hear myself well, so should be all right. As Manuela said, the topic is so very wide, and as Manuela said, so broad. And as Manuela said, I'm also very grateful for this invitation to the organizers, to the sponsors, and I'm so happy to find myself here together with colleagues that are deeply respect and that have inspired me in my work. And I think, we have worked in conversation together on this topic of racism against Eastern Europeans. I would say that, as far as I know, this is not just the first conference in Germany on this topic. It's the first conference in the world on this topic. I myself hesitated calling what officially is called Diskriminierung racism, and only started doing so a few years ago. And actually, I'm not aware that anybody was doing it explicitly using that term before, but if there was anybody, it would have been Manuela Boatka. Okay, another thing I should say is that I'm already very sensitive to the German context, and I don't work in the German context. Germany is a really great place to connect two ways to approach this topic, and one is one with historical depth. And unfortunately, Germany carries a burden of historical depth when it comes to various kinds of racisms, including that against Slavs. I'm not sure that against Eastern Europeans exactly captures that, but it's certainly where it comes from, is German racism. But I'm more interested in what happened after 1989. And this is perhaps also because I'm old, and being old is sort of being like a time traveler, you know. So I didn't see what I would travel to when I became a migrant from Eastern Europe, from Czechoslovakia, in the 60s, mid-60s, to North America. I did not experience what I started experiencing after 1989. Maybe that's just me, but that's when I started learning that I was an Eastern European and how different all that was and so forth. From hindsight, it probably existed before, but I would say at the very least that it became much stronger after 1989. So I would like to connect racism against Eastern Europeans to what happened after 1989. And I'd like to talk as briefly as I can about whether racism is really the right word for it. I think it is, but I put the question mark and the exclamation mark there because I think it's debatable, and I think we need to debate it, and I hope we'll debate it. So why are we calling it racism? And I think the reason, there are probably many reasons, but the one I like is an analogy. So I'd like to describe the analogy. Okay, so the analogy is going to be between racism in the colonial and post-colonial context and racism between the West and the Eastern parts of Europe. And we call this debate uses the term racial capitalism, and we're looking at a division between an accumulating core of the world racial capitalist system and a wealth-providing periphery, and the relationship between them is what we call extraction. So the capital is extracted from, for example, in this case, in the classical case, from the colony to the colonizer. And the other side of this economic relationship is that it's always justified by a discourse of making the periphery look really different and inferior. So at the classic level, like I said, this is between the former colonial powers and the former colonized. And the relationship between them is what we call racialized. Okay, so in that case, though, in the classic case, it's typically racialized with reference to skin color, because it so happens that those who provided the capital in the classic colonial period were of a different skin color from those who accumulated it. So because you need a language to justify this, to simplify things, but not too much, I think, you had to invent something to inferiorize the other, and the obvious thing would be skin color. Now, 1989, to make an analogy, was also, on my reading, intended to establish an extracting type of relationship between Western capital and Eastern providers of wealth. Okay, cheap labor, natural resources, and so forth. So it's analogous in that way to a colonial relationship. I know I have only 5 or 7 minutes. Someone might not agree with me, but this is how I see it, and we can discuss it. It was never really intended in the West that the East should become just like the West. I think it's quite clear now. It was intended that it should be a source of extracting capital. So then you also have to have a language that justifies the extraction, to continue with this analogy. And I call this Eastern Europeanism a language of inferiorizing and othering Eastern Europeans, which explains why they cannot accumulate capital. Because they're lazy, because they don't work hard enough, but also perhaps because they're not capable. So it means that capital accumulation in the East is not of the same kind or of the same quality as it is when it is performed by the West. So now, to continue the analogy, I suggest that we call this extracting relationship also a racialization, that we call the language that justifies the otherness and inferiority of Eastern Europeans a racialization and a racism. Okay, so when I say this, many people get upset. Like, perhaps you don't get upset. I'm so happy to see like people came to this conference and they look very, satisfied to be at a conference about racism against Eastern Europeans. But when I talk to ordinary folks, which we're not, they tend to be very upset, and they will, even after I do this talk, they will say to me, it's not racism. But they don't tell me why it's not racism. It's not racism. It just doesn't sound right. However, and maybe they suggest terms like xenophobia or prejudice would be better. But xenophobia and prejudice, even discrimination, don't capture this exploitative relationship that I have mentioned. They're about how people don't like each other, as if they were somehow at an equal level, and it disavows the economic underpinning that racism, in my opinion, always has. In my opinion, it's not about skin color, it's about exploitation. So now I would like to deal with some of the objections. And okay, let me admit, maybe there's some good objections also to using race. I don't want to be cocky about this. But I'm going to go through three that I hear often, okay? And you may raise others. Okay, so first of all, white people are all the same race, so how can you talk about racism when white people discriminate against white people? It's not racism, because they're the same race, is the point. And to this we reply, and I think I do believe that all scholars unanimously agree that racism is not about skin color, okay, or not only about skin color. It's a popular misinterpretation. It's not necessarily epidermic. Now, let me just show you that historically speaking, it's not the case that race was used only about skin color. So here, for example, is a very well-known, an excerpt from a very well-known book by William Ripley, 1900, The Races of Europe. Notice in the plural, all of these races are white. Like, Ripley did not for one moment suggest that any of them were not. And the arrows point to interesting things. At that time, Sweden was included also in Eastern Europe, and Tyrol was included in Eastern Europe by this author, because I feel that it was just a pragmatic notion, Eastern Europe, the east of Europe. So whatever was geographically in the east, he included in this map, and he includes more westerly areas, including German, in another map. Okay? But my point here is there are different shades of not white, but actually black, in Europe, according to this scheme. And it's fascinating to me that Bohemians and Moravians, but also Tyroleans, are like Tatars, because I think the whole point of this picture is that many Europeans are kind of Asiatic influence, like Tatars. So the Swedes are not at all, but Slovaks very much so. Anyway, the general point I'm making is it's not a good argument that race is only about skin color, even in terms of the term race in Europe, and I'm not even speaking about its employment by the Nazis to describe the difference between Aryans and Semites and Germans and Roma Sinti. Okay, so the second point is that people tell me is that race is an American import, so it's actually some kind of American imperialism to bring this into not just the German but European discussion, because we don't know nothing from race. That's not our problem in Europe. So I don't think there's anybody here in this room who would agree with that. But nevertheless, it's probably the case that we have to be sensitive to differences. And so I think it's worth discussing if what we mean here by race is not just the same kind of thing, but actually the same thing as, let's say, we have in the history of racism in America. Thirdly, I think the best of these bad objections is that anti-Eastern European practices and language are not as severe as epidermic racism, right? So it's less difficult to be an Eastern European than to be an African, let's say, in Germany. Now, I know that that's not always true, and more we're learning about the terrible treatment that Eastern European laborers get in many contexts in Europe, which really, frankly, is in no way worse or better than that received by people of color. But in general, there's something there, and I think I also come back to what Hans Christian said about the invisibility of the Eastern European, and that really means something. Being invisible, as opposed to being marked by skin color, obviously means that you can pass. Okay, so now racism is a matter of opportunities. Like what people suffer from is that structurally their opportunities are limited in a society. Okay, so parents who are of color think, well, my children's future, what's going to happen to them? They're going to be marked with this epidermic distinction. But someone who's from Poland or Bulgaria can think, I'll send my kids to a good school. They're going to pass. They speak the language richtig Deutsch. And probably, there may be anecdotally some difficulties, but basically their opportunities, I would assume, I don't know about Germany, but certainly in other places, will be really basically equal to people who are autochthonous. So I think this is not really a totally bad objection. I would not accept it if it means then let's not call it racism, but maybe we need some adjective with the racism to show that this is a different kind. And Walter Mignolo, who writes more about racism against Southern Europeans, speaks of intramural racism. I think that's one term I like that maybe could be used in this context. Okay, but on the whole, okay, one thing, I know I have 30 seconds. Apart from these intellectual things, though, I think we have to cover the emotional objection to racism. Why do people object? Why do they get upset? It's not just an intellectual discussion. And here I'd like to be a little nastier. Okay, so people in the West, I think, object because they don't want to look racist. Okay, so maybe it's not the case we have enough racism already in the society that we need another group to point out how racist our society is. But if I focus on people from the East like myself, and I often find this within myself and would like to totally get rid of it, is that if we are the target of racism, then it means that we are like people of color, okay? So we're on an even lower level of this hierarchy of racism that I think we'll hear about a lot in the next session. And so in order to be fully white, or richtig, I think is perhaps the best German for it, richtig weiß, okay, then I think we cannot consider ourselves victims of racism. Because, again, after all, we're white people, and white people cannot be racist against white people. Okay, yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Ivan. Our next speaker is Malte Kleinschmidt, who is wissenschaftlicher Mitarbeiter at the Institute für Didaktik und Demokratie at Leibniz University Hannover. I'm not going to translate all these work titles because I always find they don't really work in other contexts. His research explores decolonial pedagogy, so we're now moving from the macro-political perspectives a bit more into the applications of what we heard about. He also has looked into critiques of imperial lifestyles and conceptions of inclusive and performative citizenship. He has published several monographs, including his doctoral thesis, which I don't think he would like me to read out, but I will still do that because the title is so beautiful. Eurozentrismus in der Philosophie zur Machtwirkung ego-, logo- und ethnozentrischer Konzepte. I love this, the ego, logo, ethno, beautiful title. And most recently, dekoloniale politische Bildung, eine empirische Untersuchung von lernenden Vorstellungen zum postkolonialen Erbe. And I think noteworthy for our international audience here is also his co-edited collection with Linda Supik and colleagues with the title Gender, Race and Inclusive Citizenship. A very warm welcome to Malte, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for this warm introduction and the invitation and the opportunity to speak here. The last volume you mentioned, you were publishing also in it, and it's really one of the greatest articles in it, and I can just recommend it. And also I have to admit that I'm quite intimidated here in this round, because you three are like, when I speak about this or when I write about this, I'm quoting your text, and I'm like, maybe I come afterwards with a book and getting a signature from you. I want to, I want to switch now maybe the terrain about or the level on which we are thinking about it. I'm not a historian, not a sociologist. I'm coming from the area of citizenship, education. So I want to invite you now to shift from this big structures, histories of longue durée, and all this really important stuff to a German classroom. Yeah, that's where I made my studies. I talked to students in German schools. And I asked them about their ideas on globalization, and I analyzed this with a decolonial framework. So my aim was to develop an approach of decolonial citizenship education. And of course, we heard already before, in Germany, there are like 9.5. I read today in your book this number again. In the great book of Hans and Janis. 9.5 people who has roots or whose parents or who themselves migrated from the eastern parts, from East Europe. So a lot of students with whom I talked came from East Europe. So. The idea of my approach is that we don't have to bring the ideas of decoloniality to the classroom. They are already there. You know, the ideas about how global inequalities are explained, how racial differences are made. They are already there. It's not the idea to bring new truths or new knowledge there and to transmit it, but in the tradition of, for example, Paulo Freire, to make a setting, to create a setting or opportunity to reflect on their own ideas or to deepen their critical ideas of decoloniality. So a lot of students reproduced, of course, colonial patterns of thinking, but a lot of students, and the majority of them were not white or Western European, they criticized a lot of aspects of coloniality. And when I spoke to the students with roots in East Europe, a lot of them told stories like their parents had different life opportunities, or they were like ashamed of their uncles and aunts in Bosnia or in Bulgaria or whatever because of their backwardness or their uncivilized mood or even their poverty. And in a lot of these discussions with the student, they reproduced colonial patterns, and they did not have a language to criticize it. And this applies even more to people from East Europe. No one of them used the notion of racism or coloniality or whatever. Also, the others did not use it as much, but from East Europe, really no one. So there was what Anne Lawrence Stoller calls colonial aphasia, the inability to find words, to find tools to understand critically the process of inferiorization of themselves, of their culture, of their parents, of whomever. And that was really striking. So the idea with the approach of decolonial citizenship education would be that citizenship education has to provide a setting where exactly this will be possible, where these students, racialized or not, have the possibility to think about their forms of reproduction of coloniality, but also have possibilities to ally with others, to find ways to criticize, to subvert, to put into question the colonial truths which are in all the discourses. So that's the idea. And then I was asking myself, okay, I find very much the same patterns in East European student minds, which I find also in the others, in students which are racialized, for example, as Arabs or as Turkish migrants or whatever. So why should I now talk about this is racialization, and the people from East Europe, they are not racialized, they are like discriminated, or they find some prejudice or whatever. So there's like the need when decolonial citizenship education wants to bring people together, create settings to find ways for liberation, there's a need to find a common language for that. So, of course, this creates some problems. We heard about a lot of a lot of arguments which are coming up directly when you're talking about racialization and East Europe. But actually, I would see that as an opportunity maybe, and I'm really so pleased that we can discuss it here. Because I see a general problem right now in the way how racism is talked about, or how anti-racism is conceptualized. I see like an hegemony of a liberal understanding of anti-racism. And this means you both talked about it, that racialization is always connected to power, to capitalist extractivism, to the division, to the international division of labor, and I think this should be crucial. We have to rethink our theory of racism in these terms, and then maybe. It's a question. I'm also on the way, I'm like searching the discussion. I don't have the answers, but maybe we should have a theory of racism which is not putting whiteness in its center. Like the archetype. There's an archetype of racism, which in some discourses or in a lot of discourses is like, it's like the anti-black racism. It's the archetype of any racism, and then any other anti-racist analysis have to like define the relation, how it relates to this understanding of whiteness, of white supremacy. And it's absolutely not that I want to deny that. I think it's key that we need to talk about anti-black racism and about whiteness. But, for example, in the framework of coloniality, which I really appreciate, because we can think about this global inequalities. We can think about capitalist extractivism. We can think about this international division of labor and all that stuff. And yeah, sorry, now I lost my red line. So what I really think is that we don't lose anything, but we gain a lot if we look a little bit back on theories of racism, for example, in coloniality. If we look on Aníbal Quijano, who wrote that it's the coloniality and the capitalist coloniality needed this racialization, this division and conquer logic. When we look back to Stuart Hall or to W.E.B. Du Bois, who did exactly the same, or if we look back to Etienne Balibar, who, for example, said in his very famous article from 1988, "Is there a neo-racism?" Was arguing exactly about that we need a materialist theory of racism where whiteness is crucial, but not only. He for example, talked about anti-Semitism as another archetype of racism. And when we're talking about coloniality, we can think about, you already talked about Christianity. We can think about the dispute of Valladolid in 1551 between Las Casas and Sepúlveda, who were like trying to, who were discussing if the exploitation of the so-called Indian is legitimate, because if they are humans or if they are not humans. Yeah, there was a discussion about racialization and its implications, and not in terms of color. This came later. So what I want to ask this audience is, maybe it could be really productive to rethink our theory of racism at this point in terms of coloniality and in terms of different logics, which not all lead to whiteness. And then, do I have a minute?
Half a minute.
Half a minute, perfect. And then maybe, in this discussion, I find it striking that everybody's trying to find, like, for example, I really like your approaches. You are trying to find a formula in this ambiguous racialization. But all racialization is ambiguous. It's always trying, racism is always trying to homogenize something which is not at all homogenized. Like, for example, East Europe, I learned that from Anca Parvulescu, that it's so important to make a difference between East Europe, which is like geography, which when you think about it, geography, it's clear that it's not a homogeneous race living in it, and Eastern Europe, which is like Orientalism, creating a space, prescriptions, and racialization is already in it, in this logic. So what I want to say is, I think maybe we don't need to like say, oh, there is real racism and like semi-racism. Maybe we need to think about our theory of racism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Malte, for this engaged talk and the Steilvorlage. I think that's the point of ambiguous racialization. More about this later. It's my great honor now to introduce our fourth speaker, who should have been with us here today, but unfortunately, due to adverse circumstances, will be joining us online and will speak to us via the screen. Angela Kotze is Assistant Professor of Romani Studies, Chair of the Romani Studies Program, and Academic Director of the Roma Graduate Preparation Program in the Department of Sociology and Social Anthropology at Central European University in Budapest. Her research focuses on the intersections between gender, ethnicity, and class, as well as the social and legal inequalities faced by Roma communities in various European countries. Her interdisciplinary research approach thereby combines community engagement and policymaking with in-depth participatory research. She is the co-editor of the volume The Romani Women's Movement, Struggles and Debates in Central Eastern Europe, and with Huub van Baar, The Roma and Their Struggle for Identity in Contemporary Europe. And her scholarship has also received various international awards. And I find particularly inspiring about her work how she combines very thorough conceptual engagement with political advocacy and political activism. Angela, thank you so much for joining us today, and the floor is yours. I'm saying into the sky.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks for the organizers for inviting me. And I'm really grateful that you accommodated my presentation as well. I'm terribly sorry that I can't be there. So I tried to be really short as much as possible. So basically, when we are talking about East-West inequalities and the dynamics of racialization, and I think Roma is Romani people, it's really good a case studies who are cutting across this kind of East-West divides and East-West inequalities, because Roma been in Western Europe before the Brexit, after the Brexit, Roma, migrated to Western European countries even before 1989, and after that as well. So just a footnote, when I'm talking about Roma, certainly is a politically constructed category to capture various ethnic groups throughout Europe, North and South America, and other parts of the world, regardless whether they are nomadic or sedentary communities who identify as Roma, Gypsy, travelers, Sinti, Zigoiners, Cigano, Gitano, Caldera, Slovara, and so on. So I just wanted to make sure that I'm not leaving out, rather I'm using this kind of politically constructed umbrella term to denote Roma. So racialization and racial oppression of Roma are discursive and structural mechanisms that place them in an imaginary hierarchical classificatory system based on phenotypical, cultural, and social markers, and render them as other, subhuman, inhuman, that is the dehumanizing process, right? So these oppressive discourses become articulated and solidified in concrete social practices, mechanisms, policies, and structures in Roma people's everyday lives. In academia, the racialization of Roma has either been neglected or not theorized at the same level of details as for other racialized groups, including Blacks, Jews, Muslims, and others. Perhaps the negligence of Roma in mainstream race racialization-related scholarship is merely a reflection on the tacitly enacted racial and epistemic hierarchy. And Roma-related scholarship, however, has found countless ways to talk about racialization without drawing on the category of race or the process of racialization. The terms include Romani lifestyle, otherized minority, ethnicized poverty, minoritized population, and so on. You see that we are always, referring to some kind of racialization of Roma. Recently, a new trend has emerged, mainly through the School of Critical Race Theory and feminist intersectional theory, which use race as an analytical category besides gender, class, and others, and racialization as a process and condition to explore the situation of Roma. Bonilla Silva suggests some new directions in critical race theory, including the imperative of new theoretical and empirical work, which has to come from subaltern scholars. In academia, the widely shared assumption is that epistemology and knowledge production is neutral and detached from the social, political, and economic context. So this belief has been challenged by feminist and Black theories. As a result of the influence of these innovative works, decades later, Romani feminist scholars have become the front runners in challenging racist and sexist epistemology and the notion of neutral knowledge production in Europe. I wanted to start with that because I think it's very important to recognize and recall the work of Romani feminist scholars who really brought into the discussion of the concept of race and racialization. And talking about the conceptual work, actually I brought 3 categories or 3 concepts, what we want to deal with that later on. So the first is the biological and cultural racism, the biological and cultural racism, which have been applied to Roma and traveler people in the early formation of European racialization, and were reinvigorated and reinvented during specific areas, such as during the Second World War, under Nazism, and also the post-Holocaust narrative about the persecution of Roma is still lacks visibility and very much under research and is rarely taught at various universities. So certain racist tropes solidified during the Nazi era continue to persist and circulate, often utilized by political and socioeconomic circumstances to exclude and denigrate groups. For example, the wanton's exclusion of Roma over centuries, for example, in Ladagna and Saligny's work. So familiar tropes, often gendered, include the gypsy threat, the gypsy problem, the gypsy crime, the divide, the uncivilized gypsy, the benefit cheat, the nomad, feral, delinquent children, and so on. So such tropes leaves no room for diversities of experience, voice, resistance, or agency. And what I would like to emphasize here, that biological racism somehow is transferred or transformed into a kind of cultural racism in Europe. And the second type of racism, what I think it's very important to mention, is the structural racism and the assertion of Roma as instrumental in creating their own poverty, and those being dependent on welfare system is endemic, is still like a kind of belief. And research shows that when extreme poverty is represented in many European countries, even in a sympathetic light, readers and audiences still link poverty to a gypsy characteristics rather than an issue of racism and injustice. And in education, Romani children experience blatant or more concealed ethno-social segregation in classrooms in all member states, as it was pointed out and showed through various researches such as Julia Salaz's work, which has been published in 2014. Exclusion of Roma, Gypsy, and traveler people is also evident in training and labor markets. So racial discrimination is in employment, and its intersection with gender, housing, marginalization, and health is well documented by the fundamental rights agencies. And furthermore, a disproportionate number of Roma, Gypsy, and traveler people live in the poorest regions and pockets of deprivation across Europe, which can combine all the forms of exclusion. And leads to place discrimination, sometimes referred to as ghettoization. So even though that we have an abundance of research which are showing the structural inequality and the structural racism of Roma, but we can find a very few theorization of that. And the third one and the last one, because I would like to be very much aware about my time as well, is the epistemic racism or epistemic violence or epistemic injustice, what we can hear from Miranda Vickers, which very much relate to knowledge production. And also it include exclusion, silencing, and distorting or undervaluing these people's knowledge in an academia. So there's a long overdue decolonization in Romani studies, is starting to occur, the effects of gypsy industry in academia, as some of the scholars call it, in which individuals and institutions, mostly non-Roma, receive material gains, funding, promotion, platforms for taking the Roma theme and become gatekeepers, is now recognized and discussed. So several authors refer to that as Nascher and Ian Hancock as well. However, such an industry is centuries old. Scholarly work on the so-called gypsies in the 19th century found a foothold with academics keen to capitalize on the media's sensationalist headlines and public political interest. For example, the German historian Heinrich Brauman's 18th century text became influential across Europe on gypsy customs and way of life just at the time when some sensationalized media stories about gypsy cannibalism had captivated the readers of the fashionable new printing press. However, Brauman himself had not done any original research on Roma gypsy or tribal people, but had another combined many sources that themselves had dubious authenticity, a tendency of academics that extended beyond the 19th centuries. I don't want to, go further with that kind of illustration and also this kind of epistemic injustice and violence, what happened even in a knowledge production as well. But I wanted to introduce and bring introduce as a concept and bring into our conversation, which hopefully will be very constructive and fruitful. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Angela. I've lost my panelists. Would they care to rejoin me? So what we will be doing for the remainder of the time, I will direct some questions to my fantastic roundtable here. We'll see how long we'll take. We've prepared a few, but I would like to leave half an hour for the audience to also have a chance to engage with you guys. So, Manuela, may I start with you? Tell us, tell us why are race and racism so absent in debates around the east of Europe, and particularly around mobilities from the east of Europe? How can we understand this?
That's a very important question, and there's a very short answer to it and a longer one. The short answer is coloniality. Through the European colonial expansion, the idea that race is elsewhere was initiated. The other, the non-European, the white, was invented as part of what was discovered by European colonizers. Before the European colonial expansion, nobody in Europe thought of themselves as white. They did not think of themselves as Europeans either. The kind of identification was through religious denominations, through the principalities or whatever political formations people identified with, and the crown that was financing the colonial expansion maybe, but that was it. Through the colonial expansion and the encounter with an other, and there the debate that Malte Kleinschmidt mentioned, the one between Juan Gines de Sepúlveda and Bartolomé de las Casas in 1550, was about whether or not this other is at all human. Do they have a soul? Is it worth it for us to even Christianize people who do not have souls? So racism is based in dehumanization, but race was elsewhere. And through different waves of racist pogroms, including pogroms against Jews, against Muslims, and those considered lesser Europeans in Europe, Europe constructed at least the idea of itself as an ethnically homogeneous continent, where racist conflicts, racist riots happen elsewhere. This is exactly the way it's being theorized in mid-20th century after the decolonization of many former European colonies, when migration from non-European territories starts coming into Europe. And in Britain, the way this is theorized is about racial riots. The ones that create conflict that we did not have before are coming from elsewhere and are bringing trouble to our pacified, our civilized, our stable territories. So this is linked to the idea of race coming into Europe to destabilize the long fought for order and peace. And it has something to do academically also with the fact that we have a migration studies field emerging at that time, which all of a sudden discovers that there's migration, while Europeans had migrated to the colonies for centuries and had actually eased that kind of economic pressure also in Europe. But this was not theorized as either race, nor was it migration. Migration becomes a phenomenon that is visible once it affects Europe. And so it is migration that is racialized, something also that was first addressed, to my knowledge, by Étienne Balibar in the context of France, when he said, we don't talk about race in France, we talk about immigration, which is very absurd if we think about it, because it's not the same category, they're not on the same level. Immigration is a process and race is the result of a racialization process. But to speak about immigration and to mean race is exactly showing the colors, pardon the pun, of thinking that race comes from elsewhere into Europe, and Europe is actually raceless. And so this is why I think it's important to connect both.
Thank you so much for the sweeping account of all of Europe. Angela, would you like to add something to this?
Yeah, just very quickly, actually, that it's really, really hard to talk about race and racialization in an academic context, and I find really useful and very important the work of József Bőrös, whom you know, many of you, I'm sure that, and I would like to quote him from his article on the Euro-wide concept, dirty white resentment, race in Europe. So, because it's very much captured, I think, the atmosphere as well when we are talking about and the kind of, common understanding what's going on. So, quoting him, as far as I can see, it is not true that there is no race in Europe, nor is race an American concept. The problem is that it's essentially almost impossible to talk about it openly in contemporary Europe. And following his thinking, it is too embarrassing to admit the continued existence of race, especially for collective mindset that is otherwise fully committed to a self-image as a possessor of the greatest cultural, civilizational achievements of humankind. Arguably, the very existence, Euro-whiteness, is a key reason why it is so difficult to talk openly about race in Europe today. So, quotation close. I think it's quite clear, actually, that what he's talking about, that race has always been treated as a foreign, as a concept which belongs to America. We don't need to talk about it because that's an American concept. And with that sentence, we completely delegitimizing even the academic discourse about race and racialization. The other thing, and also another point what I wanted to bring into the discussion, that the exclusion of racialization, or the talk about racialization in global hierarchies. So when we are talking about, post-structuralism, postmodernism, the grand narrative imperialism is on the wane, right? And it's seldom discussed in relation to Roma exclusion and racialization in the global hierarchies. No, I would put here that, of course, African Americans, Black scholars, Frederick Roderson and others, they were talking about, but not in a European context. I'm talking about particular Roma. And what I wrote in my previous papers, quoting there, why structural imperialism explains the persistent inequalities between imperialist and exploited countries, referring to Galtung. The word system analysis goes beyond the nation or state-centered political structure. It provides an understanding on the imperialization of interconnected transnational political units entangled with world economy between and within countries at the centers, semi-peripheries and peripheries. Most world system scholars recognize the significance of racism, but tend to regard race and racialization as an ideology or symptom of the global capitalist system, mainly referring to Balibar and Wallerstein's work from 1991. In Wallerstein's understanding, both racism and sexism are ideologies that sustain and reproduce the global capitalist economy. Quote, racism allows a far lower reward to major segment of the workforce than could ever be justified on the basis of merit. Quotation closed. Here, Wallerstein is mainly referring to the exploited and underpaid working class, which can be composed of white and racialized group, but does not explain the racialized structural unemployment faced by many Roma in Europe. So I'm talking about particularly those group of Roma who are completely abandoned, neglected, and ignored by the system, and suffering from racist oppression and racialization.
Thank you so much, Angela. Such an important reminder. And Ivan and I had this experience when we tried to get a paper included in our special issue on blackness in Poland, which was met by a huge backlash in terms of, there's no race in Poland. So that was a big struggle, but we got there. What does the study of race and racism, or what do we benefit from adding concepts like race and racism to the study of mobilities from the east to the west of Europe? Shall we ask Ivan?
What we gain by adding racism to understanding East-West relations in Europe, particularly mobilities, or
can be with or without mobility.
Well, I think what we gain is that it places it in a global context, and to relate to what has been said before, it helps us not to disavow racism within Europe. So there are various difficulties also, but as I tried to say in my earlier intervention, racism goes together with extractivism. It goes together with economic inequality and the direction of capital flows. And I believe that is an analogy with the colonial exploitation. So I think we'll gain an extension of our perspective to the global stage and to the global workings of capitalism when we speak of racism between East and West in Europe. Yeah.
Malte?
Thanks, you already said what I wanted to answer to this question. So, of course, coloniality again, it's the answer. But maybe on a more political level spoken, I think it's if we go back to my classroom, or I'm from Oldenburg, it's a small city in the northwest of Germany, and it's like a really a center for agricultural production and meat industry. And of course, also, if you look at the care workers or construction sites or whatever, we find a lot of people from mostly now Romania and Bulgaria working there in horrible conditions, but of course also from Syria, from Afghanistan, from Ivory Coast, from a lot of countries. People are there and they are humiliated. They are like reduced to labor force, disenfranchised. So really horrible conditions, and a lot of human rights seem not to apply to this group of workers. And I think it's important to understand, to have an analysis which groups them together, which makes it comprehensible. Of course, there are differences. For example, from the state, there are this is the foreign law, which is like producing a lot of pressure for people from Syria, from Turkey, and so on. And it's mostly the welfare state law, which is producing the institutional pressure on migrants from East Europe, at least from Romania and Bulgaria. So there are slight differences, but to have a theory, to have a category, to think them together is not only analytical important and correct, I guess, but it's also important to provide the possibility for alliances, to not play the game, the colonial game of divide and conquer, but to make it possible to group these people, which are very often divided by these ambiguous identities, and even racism between them, but to struggle for alliances to hopefully change something politically.
Thank you very much. So we've all now related multiple times racialization to coloniality, to racial capitalism, to neoliberalism. May I ask you, Manuela, what are the implications of this macro-political perspective to the politics of redress within the state, and what role do institutions play in producing and reproducing racism?
Yeah, a huge role. So the first answer to that would be the public institutions also have to listen to the analytical takes on racism and not hide between discourses of racelessness. But that is kind of a starting point. This is why we're all here, because we actually don't want this to happen. So it sounds like it's too general an answer. So I'm going to try to give an example, picking up also on what Angela said about the actually invisibilization of anti-Roma racism in Europe. So in Romania, Roma people were enslaved for over 500 years. There has been huge economic benefit to the Romanian state from this enslavement, but just as in the case of enslavement in the Americas and elsewhere, when slavery was abolished, it was only the landlords and the state that were compensated for their loss of enslaved labor, not the enslaved people. To this day, there hasn't been any even remote understanding of any redress or reparation. There hasn't been an apology from the Orthodox Church, which was one of the main enslavers at the time. And that is connected to an idea that there is no race in Romania, just as there is no race in Europe. So hiding behind this idea that, first of all, it was a long time ago. Second of all, this was an exception, and I still hear that from historians when they go against the idea that there's no race in Europe. And I say, well, what about the enslavement of Roma people for 500 years? And they say, oh, but the Roma people are an exception. An exception of 500 years is quite a lot to brush away. So there is a huge responsibility, I think, starting but not limited to the state, to such institutions as the church, not only the Orthodox Church, but the Catholic Church as well. But at least the Pope has apologized to Romani people in Romania, although the enslavement was done by the Orthodox Church, for the damage perpetrated by enslavement. But there is a huge responsibility and a huge task ahead regarding the way we address race and racism in schools, in textbooks, in making it the core problem to start with when we discuss constructions of Europeanness, and the many exclusions, the violence, the pogroms, and the racializations that are ongoing today as part of European history, as part of what it means to be European. And that means not only preaching the modernity of Europe, but also its coloniality, the dark side of modernity that will stay there and will kind of breed further evil unless we bring it forth.
Thank you so much, Manuela. Ivan.
So I think this very challenging question also brings up some, I would say, almost painful issues that is difficult to address. So I'm thinking about the state's policy in order to counter racism against different kinds of people. If we include Eastern Europeans, it means the state's policy the state's anti-racism or anti-Diskriminierung policies should include Eastern Europeans. Now, that's not an uncomplicated question. So perhaps it's easier in terms of migrants, if we focus on migrants in Germany, because indeed, I think quite arguably, migrants from Eastern Europe suffer the same kind of problems as migrants of color. And so policies might be to integrate migrants as the way, this is the way in Germany that it's usually articulated. But once we get beyond the migrants, and if we continue to see that people are still being discriminated, which is more the case that we find in North America. Okay, so there the racism is much less about recent migrants and more about people of various extractions. And I would argue that in North America today, Eastern Europeans are also discriminated against and subject to racism, but certainly not with the same history or with the same structural obstacles or with the same inability to pass for a real American or Canadian or what have you than people of color. So when we have affirmative action, equality, inclusion policies, do we include Eastern Europeans? So if there's a policy to promote people to get jobs as professors or to get into graduate school, which favors people of color, do we add Eastern Europeans to these groups that should be pushed through affirmative action? And, you know, much as we're theoretically all for solidarity, you can certainly imagine how that question would not necessarily lead to solidarity, because these EDI programs are, in the real lives of people, are programs for individuals to advance themselves, especially young people. Okay? And although it's not a zero-sum game, but it certainly does help somebody if they can take advantage of such a program. Now, I'm not totally, not even very much at all familiar if in Germany this would be a problem, but it could be. Okay? So that's one issue that I'm raising. Like, my personal reaction is that probably Eastern Europeans, contrary to what I say in my work, should not be included in EDI programs. But I'm really not sure about that. And I find it a very painful question. Another issue here, which is more closer to Germany, and it might even seem absurd to you German people, but there is an analogy between the treatment of Western Europeans, of Eastern Europeans, in Germany, in the treatment of Eastern Germans by Western Germans. Okay, and the extractionism that has taken place at many levels between East and West Germany is probably more extreme than in any other East European so-called area, because it's the same state. Okay, so basically there was little barrier to replacing, for example, almost every Eastern German professor with a West German professor, to just stick close to our purview. So, would it be okay to call what Wessis feel about Ossis racism? Antiosteuropäischer Rassismus? And, you know, I would say yes, but I can see people are saying no, okay? So please, reflect on why you're saying no. Because I think there is, among the many other reasons, there is the one I mentioned at the end of my contribution. Nobody wants to be regarded as those who are even lower in the hierarchy. And to say that Germans could be the target of racism, and by Germans, it seems totally absurd, and I'm sure that nobody's going to go for it. But from the theoretical point of view, I would say, yeah, it's a version of anti-Eastern European racism at the ideological level, not so much at the labor level, but also in many cases, and at the level of capital, certainly.
Thank you for this question, Ivan. I'm sure we'll come back to this one. I certainly have ants in my pants. I'd like to, but I'm not going to abuse my role as a chair. I have a final question. So what's the chance of the politics of anti-discrimination to address the structural inequalities that we have discussed? Shall we start with Angela? I think you're still muted, Angela.
Sorry.
No worries.
I'm here, right? Do you hear me? Yes. Okay. So I just would like to refer back to the previous question, because I think it's very important, and connect to the new one, of course, that when we are talking about actually color blindness, particularly in these days, right? We don't want to see race. And one author, it came up in my mind, George Lipschitz, who is a critical race theorist, and he's talking about that very few problems can be solved by pretending that they do not exist, right? In a society which is plagued by pervasive racial stratification and subordination, race-bound problems require a race-conscious, race-based remedies. And I think it's very, very pertinent, particularly thinking about the neoliberal trends in European countries. We don't want to see race, right? And we don't want to give a special reference to Roma or migrants and so on, because that would discriminate the others, the majority. So I think so. It's a colorblind theory, and colorblind ideologies is again, it's a good way of masking the huge racial stratification and inequality what we are facing in Europe. And can the politics of anti-discrimination challenge these inequalities, as you asked? That's certainly not. So I think anti-discrimination policies alone, it maybe won't be that effective as if we would couple with other inequality policies, and we would couple with affirmative positive action that address structural racism. I'm saying this because, like, usually, particularly like after the EU accession in the 1990s, there was a lot of talk about anti-discrimination and marginalization and discrimination against Roma or women's and so on, and we have to combat against poverty and social exclusion, but we didn't talk about, what does it implies in politics, in an action. And I think it would be really important to think about how can we redress, how can we address these kinds of severe racial inequality what exists in Europe, even in academia as well, or in an educational system. Or if I'm thinking about the COVID-19 pandemic, right, which was very recently, which created again a huge health inequalities and discrimination, which was very much coupled with Roma racialization, and there were several reports which showed that Roma people, particularly in the poorer areas, are being adversely affected by the illness and are not receiving the right treatment. So there is also has been an increase in racist incidents as people suspect and blame Roma communities for spreading the virus. So why I'm saying this, because these were there. So scholars, researchers wrote about it. There were several reports, but we didn't really address it at the political level, or we didn't really provided any kind of specific policies against that. So anti-discrimination politics of anti-discrimination challenge some kinds of inequalities, but it has to be coupled with some other class-based, gender-based, and many other-based inequalities, which somehow, hopefully, going to create some kind of solidarities amongst this group. Not just in theory, but hopefully in practice as well.
Thank you very much, Angela. And Malte, perhaps a short final answer to this one, so we can open up.
I try to stay very brief. Thanks, Angela. You already answered a lot of what I wanted to say. I would answer to this question that, of course, anti-discrimination policies cannot end racism. The state wouldn't fund anything which leads to a world without racial capitalism right now. It's not where we're living in, right? But of course, it can contribute to something like that. It's a question of hegemony. If anti-discrimination offices or NGOs or whatever, if they can contribute to it, they are more conservative ones. There's just a lot of struggle on money where I live in this NGO sector. Who's earning the money? The one who's co-optating these ideas of anti-racism to individualize, depoliticize all this, or if groups for example, Also, where I live, get it, where this anti-discrimination politics is part or is creating spaces where people come together, where exactly these questions are at stake. How can alliances really challenge racialization, capitalist exploitation, and all this? And this is a question of hegemony, so it's not possible to answer from here, right?
Thank you very much. So some skepticism here as to the politics of anti-discrimination. I think we'll hear a lot more about this in the afternoon panel, perhaps also more endorsements for it. Thanks so much to all our speakers for the great input, and we'd love to hear your questions.